Just bring the wine. No need to talk." The words didn't echo. They sliced, clean and effortless, across the soft jazz and crystal clinks of the Manhattan rooftop. A $2 billion deal sat waiting at the center of the table, but Ethan Cole didn't look at numbers right now. He didn't look at people either. Especially not her. Naomi Brooks stood still for half a second, bottle in hand, the amber light catching the calm in her eyes. Not anger. Not surprise. Recognition. Because she knew that voice. Knew the rhythm of it. Knew the man behind it long before the tailored suit, the headlines, the empire. But Ethan didn't know her. Of course he didn't. Men like him didn't remember nights they survived. They only remembered mornings they conquered. Around them, the room shimmered with quiet power. Custom suits, low voices, deals measured in millions per sentence. Outside, the city stretched in glass and steel, every window a reflection of ambition. Inside, Naomi moved like she belonged to none of it and saw through all of it. She poured the wine slowly, steady hand, precise tilt, not a drop wasted. Ethan finally glanced up, impatient, distracted, already halfway back into his world of numbers and control. "That's enough," he said, barely a flicker of acknowledgement. Naomi nodded once. Professional, composed, invisible, just the way the room preferred her. But then she lingered. Just slightly. Just enough to break the rhythm. Ethan noticed that. His eyes narrowed, not in curiosity, but irritation. People didn't pause around him. They performed, they delivered, they disappeared. That was the order. "Something else?" he asked, tone clipped, already expecting silence. Naomi met his eyes. And for the first time that night, something shifted. Not in the room. In him. Because there was no hesitation in her gaze. No fear. No need. Just a quiet weight that didn't belong in a place like this. "You don't remember me," she said softly. Not a question. A statement. The words didn't raise volume, but they lowered the temperature. Ethan leaned back slightly, studying her now, really looking. Not her uniform. Not her role. Her face. Searching. Calculating. Nothing. "Should I?" he replied, a faint edge of amusement slipping in, the kind powerful men wore when the world failed to surprise them. Naomi didn't react. She reached into her apron, slow, deliberate, and placed something small on the polished table between them. Metal. Worn. Ordinary. Except it wasn't. Ethan's eyes dropped. His breath didn't stop, but it changed. Just enough. A lighter. Old. Scratched. Familiar in a way that didn't make sense yet. The room continued around them. Voices, deals, laughter, but for a moment, none of it touched the space between them. Naomi's voice came again, quieter this time, but heavier. "You were standing in the rain," she said. "You didn't have $1 to your name." Ethan's fingers hovered over the lighter, not touching it, not yet. Because something was moving now. Not memory. Not fully. But something deeper. Something he hadn't needed in years. "And you said," she continued, steady as ever, "you didn't think you'd make it through the night." Silence pressed in. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just present. Waiting. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole didn't have control of the room. He had something far more dangerous. A past, walking back toward him. The lighter did not belong on that table. Not among crystal glasses and million-dollar signatures. Not in a room where everything was polished, curated, controlled. And yet there it was, small, scratched, unapologetically real. Ethan stared at it like it was a crack in the version of himself he had built. "That is not possible," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. His voice had lost something. Not strength. Certainty. Naomi did not move. She did not need to. The weight of the moment was already doing the work. "You were standing outside a diner on 8th Avenue, she continued, her tone calm, almost distant, like she was describing a scene from a film he had forgotten he starred in. 3 in the morning. It was raining so hard the streetlights looked like they were melting. Ethan's jaw tightened. The room blurred again, the quiet conversations around him turning into background noise. Not gone. Just irrelevant. "You asked me if I had $1, Naomi said. "Not for food. For a phone call." His fingers twitched. He could feel it now. Not the full memory. Just fragments. Cold. Wet. A kind of silence that only comes when everything has already fallen apart. "I told you I did not carry cash," she went on, her eyes never leaving his. "But I bought you coffee anyway. And a sandwich. Turkey. You said it was the best. thing you had ever tasted. A faint breath escaped him. Not a laugh. Not quite disbelief. Something in between. A lot of people have bad nights, he said, trying to rebuild distance, to put structure back into the moment. That does not mean I remember every stranger who helps me. Naomi nodded once, as if she expected that answer. As if she had already lived through it before he even spoke. You are right, she said softly. You do not remember every stranger. She glanced at the lighter, then back at him. But I remember what you said after. Ethan's gaze dropped again, pulled toward the object like gravity had shifted. The metal was worn where fingers had held it too tightly. There was a small dent near the edge. He knew that dent. He did not know how he knew. Just that he did. You said. Naomi continued, her voice steady. If you ever made it out, if you ever became someone, you would come back and thank the people who helped you survive. The words landed slower than anything before. Not sharp. Not loud. Just undeniable. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him, but he did not feel comfortable. He felt exposed. Not in front of the room. In front of himself. People say a lot of things when they are desperate, he replied, but even he could hear it now. The defense was thin. Naomi gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. Not mocking. Not bitter. Just honest. Yes, she said. They do. A pause settled between them, longer this time. He finally reached forward. His fingers touched the lighter. Warm from the room, but carrying something colder beneath it. History. Choice. A version of himself he had buried under success. Why keep it? He asked, quieter now, the edge gone completely. Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering him, not the billionaire, not the man at the center of the table, just the person sitting in front of her. Because, she said, some people forget who they were the moment life gets easier. Her eyes held his. Steady. Unshaken. And someone has to remember for them. The lighter felt heavier than it should have. Not because of its weight, but because of what it carried. Ethan turned it slowly between his fingers, the faint scrape of metal against skin louder than the entire room around him. Conversations continued, glasses touched, deals hovered in the air, but none of it reached him now. He was somewhere else. Somewhere colder. Somewhere quieter. You said you were going to build something. Naomi continued, her voice steady, pulling him deeper into a memory he had spent years outrunning. Not for money. Not for power. But because you were tired of being invisible. The word lingered. Invisible. It did not belong to the man sitting at the center of $1 billion negotiation. And yet it fit too well. Ethan's grip tightened slightly. He could see flashes now. Not clear images. Just pieces. A flickering streetlight. Rain hitting concrete. His reflection in a dark window, barely recognizable even to himself. You told me, Naomi said, that the worst part was not failing. It was feeling like no one would notice if you disappeared. His breath slowed. Not controlled. Not calculated. Just different. The kind of breathing that comes when something inside you is shifting whether you want it to or not. That does not sound like me, he said finally, but there was no confidence behind it. No edge. Just distance. Naomi did not argue. She did not need to. No, she agreed softly. It does not sound like who you are now. The sentence landed without force, but it did not need force. Truth rarely does. Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows near the table, the posture no longer commanding, no longer dominant. Just present. Why are you telling me this? He asked, his voice lower now, almost careful. Naomi studied him for a moment, as if weighing something unseen. Not his status. Not his money. Something else. Because tonight, she said, you spoke to me the same way people used to speak to you. Silence followed. Not awkward. Not empty. Full. Heavy. Unavoidable. Ethan's eyes flickered, just once, but it was enough. Enough to reveal the crack. The connection. The realization forming whether he accepted it or not. He looked around the table instinctively, at the executives, the partners, the observers waiting for him to lead, to decide, to dominate the room like he always did. They were still watching him. But for the first time, he was not performing for them. He was confronting something much smaller. And much larger. Himself. Naomi reached for the wine bottle again, calm, precise, finishing the job she had started. As if nothing had changed. But everything had. You built everything you said you would, she added quietly. The company. The reputation. The control. She set the bottle down with a soft click. You just left one thing behind. Ethan did not look up immediately. His eyes stayed on the lighter, his reflection faintly visible in its worn surface. Distorted. Incomplete. What is that? He asked. Naomi stepped back slightly, returning to the distance the room expected of her, but her voice remained clear. The part of you that cared who you stepped over on the way up. The words did not echo. They settled. Deep. Final. And for a moment that stretched longer than any negotiation, longer than any deal, Ethan Cole sat in silence, holding the one object that proved he had not always been this man, and realizing that the most expensive thing he had ever lost was not money, was not time, but memory of the person he once promised he would never become. The lighter remained in his hand, but it no longer felt like an object. It felt like evidence. Proof that the man sitting in this chair was not the whole story. Ethan's thumb brushed over the den again, slower this time, as if trying to unlock something deeper, something buried beneath years of success and silence. Around him, the room began to shift. Not physically, socially. One of the executives cleared his throat, glancing at his watch, then at the untouched contract resting between them. Another leaned in slightly, whispering, "We are ready when you are, Ethan." The words were polite, but the pressure was clear. Deals did not wait. Power did not pause. But Ethan did not answer. Not immediately. Because for the first time in a long time, the numbers on that paper felt smaller than the weight in his chest. He looked up at Naomi again, really looked this time, not as a server, not as a background presence, but as someone standing firmly in a moment he could not control. "What happened after that night?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharp edges that once defined it. Naomi did not seem surprised by the question. She had been waiting for it. Not for validation. Not for recognition. Just for the truth to be asked. "You left," she said simply. "The rain stopped around sunrise. You said you had somewhere to be." Ethan's brow tightened slightly, searching, trying to catch hold of something solid in the fragments forming inside his mind. "And you?" he asked. Naomi gave a small shrug, almost casual, but not dismissive. "I went back to work," she said. "Another shift. Another table. Another night where no one remembered my name." There was no bitterness in her tone. That was what made it heavier. It was not a complaint. It was a fact. Ethan leaned back again, but this time the movement did not create distance. It created space. Space for something uncomfortable to settle in. "You never tried to find me?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could measure it. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said, "because that night was not about who you would become." A brief pause. It was about who you were when no one was watching. The words pressed in, quiet but undeniable. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition. He glanced down at the contract again, the bold numbers, the signatures waiting for his approval, the kind of moment that used to define everything for him. And yet, it felt distant now, like a conversation he was no longer part of. "You could have said something sooner," he said, not accusatory, not defensive, just searching for something to hold on to. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Would it have mattered?" she asked gently. The question did not challenge him. It exposed him. Ethan did not answer right away, because the truth was immediate and uncomfortable. No, it would not have mattered. Not before this moment. Not before he was forced to see. Naomi took a small step back, returning to the invisible line that separated her world from his. But something had already crossed that line. Something that could not be undone. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Cole," she said calmly, her tone professional again, the kind that belonged to this room, to this role, to the version of reality everyone else still believed in. But as she turned to leave, Ethan spoke again, faster this time, before the moment could close. "Wait." The word stopped her, but only for a second. She turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him. Ethan stood up. Not dramatically, not for attention, but because sitting no longer felt right. Not anymore. Not after. Remembering what it felt like to be the one standing, asking, hoping someone would see him. The room noticed that. Conversation slowed. Eyes shifted. Power, for the first time that night, was no longer where it had been. Ethan held the lighter tighter, then looked at her, not as a stranger, not as a server, but as the one person in the room who knew the version of him he could not hide from. "I think I owe you more than just a thank you," he said, his voice steady, but no longer distant. Naomi's expression did not change. Not impressed. Not moved. Just present. No, she replied softly. You do not owe me anything. A small pause. Just long enough to let the next words land exactly where they needed to. You owe yourself a memory you chose to forget. And just like that, the distance between them was no longer about wealth, or status, or power. It was about truth. And Ethan Cole was standing in it, for the first time in years. Naomi did not wait for permission to leave. She turned fully this time, stepping away from the table with the same quiet precision she had carried all night, as if nothing had happened, as if the air had not shifted, as if a man's entire sense of self had not just been cracked open in front of a room full of power. But Ethan felt it. Every step she took away from him felt louder than any deal being discussed behind him. We really need to finalize this, one of the executives said again, a little firmer now, sliding the contract an inch closer across the table. The paper made a soft sound, but it might as well have been thunder. Ethan did not look at it. Not yet. His eyes stayed fixed on Naomi as she moved through the room, blending back into the role everyone expected her to play. Invisible. Replaceable. Forgotten. The same way he had been once. The same way he had promised he never would be again. And yet somewhere along the way, he had not escaped that reality. He had recreated it. Just from the other side. His grip tightened around the lighter. The dent pressed into his thumb, grounding him in something real, something that did not care about numbers or status or reputation. Ethan, another voice cut in, sharper now, carrying the weight of expectation. This deal does not wait. That sentence used to mean everything. It used to define urgency, success, identity. But now it sounded incomplete. Like it was missing something essential. Or maybe like he had been missing something all along. He exhaled slowly, then did something no one at that table had ever seen him do before. He pushed the contract back. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just clear enough. The movement was small, but the effect was immediate. Silence spread across the table, faster than any announcement could have. Confusion followed. Then disbelief. We can revisit this, he said calmly, his voice steady but no longer commanding the way it once had. It did not demand control. It carried choice. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. Revisit? One of the partners repeated, almost laughing, unsure if he had heard correctly. Ethan, this is $2 billion. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the number, acknowledging the weight it used to carry. I know, he said. That is exactly why I am not signing it right now. The room did not understand. It could not. Because this was not about money anymore. It was about something far more dangerous. Perspective. He stood fully this time, straightening his jacket, not as a gesture of dominance, but as someone preparing to step into something uncertain. Uncontrolled. Real. His eyes moved again, searching the room, finding her near the far end, refilling another glass, her movements as composed as ever, untouched by the storm she had just placed in his hands. Excuse me, he said, not to her, but to the table, to the room, to the version of himself that had always stayed seated no matter what. And then he walked away. Not rushed, not hesitant, deliberate. Each step cutting through expectation, through routine, through the invisible lines that had always separated people like him from people like her. Conversations paused as he passed. Eyes followed, not because of his status, because of his direction. He stopped a few feet behind her, close enough to speak, far enough to choose his words. Naomi, he said, her name steady on his tongue now, no longer unfamiliar, no longer distant. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze again, the same calm, the same clarity, as if she had known he would come. Or maybe as if it did not matter whether he did or not. Ethan held the lighter up slightly, not as proof, not as leverage, but as something else entirely. That night, he said quietly, you did more than help me. A pause. Not for effect. For truth. You gave me something I built my entire life on. Naomi's expression did not shift, but something in her eyes softened. Not because of his words. Because of what they cost him to say. Ethan took a breath, steady but unfamiliar, like he was learning how to speak again without the armor he had worn for years. And I forgot the person who gave it to me. The sentence landed without defense, without justification, without distance. Just truth. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole was not trying to win the moment. He was trying to understand it. Naomi did not respond right away. She let the silence settle, not as pressure, but as space, the kind of space most people rush to fill because they are uncomfortable sitting in truth. She studied Ethan for a moment, not the billionaire standing in front of her, but the man trying to remember who he had been before the world taught him to forget. "You did not forget me," she said finally, her voice calm, measured. "You forgot what it felt like to need someone." The words did not accuse. They revealed. Ethan lowered the lighter slightly, his fingers loosening around it, not because it mattered less, but because it had already done what it needed to do. "I thought becoming successful meant I would never feel that way again," he admitted, his tone quieter now, almost reflective, like he was hearing himself for the first time. Naomi gave a small nod. "It does," she said, "but it is not supposed to erase the part of you that understands it." A server passed behind her, carrying a tray, the soft clink of glasses briefly filling the space between them before fading again. The world had resumed its rhythm, but theirs had not. Ethan glanced past her for a second, back toward the table he had left behind, where suits and expectations still waited, still watched, still tried to make sense of what had just shifted. "Everything I built," he said slowly, choosing each word with care now, "came from that night, from that moment." Naomi's expression softened just slightly, not from pride, not from validation, but from recognition of something honest. "No," she said gently. "It came from you deciding to stand up the next morning." A pause. Then she added, "I just reminded you that you could." The distinction landed deeper than anything else she had said. Ethan nodded faintly, absorbing it, understanding that what he had built was his, but what he had lost along the way was also his responsibility. "Then let me fix this," he said, the words coming more firmly now, not with the force of authority, but with the weight of intention. "Whatever you need, whatever you want, I can make it happen." Naomi shook her head before he could finish. Not dismissive. "Certain. That is not how this works," she replied. "You cannot repay a moment by buying it back." Ethan hesitated, the reflex to solve, to provide, to control the outcome still present, but no longer dominant. "Then what does this look like?" he asked, not demanding, but asking in a way he had not done in years. Naomi held his gaze, steady as ever. "It looks like you remembering," she said. "Not just tonight, not just this conversation, but every time someone stands in front of you, and you have the choice to see them or not." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any contract he had ever signed. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not reset you, but shifts you. "And if I forget again?" he asked, quieter now, almost honest in a way that did not need to impress anyone. Naomi gave a small, knowing smile. "You will," she said. "Everyone does." She stepped back slightly, creating just enough distance to remind him that this moment, as powerful as it felt, was still temporary, still human. "The difference is," she added, "whether you choose to remember faster next time." Ethan looked at her, really looked, not as a symbol, not as a lesson, but as a person who had lived something he was only now beginning to understand. The lighter rested in his hand, no longer just a memory, but a responsibility. Around them, the city lights flickered through the glass, reflections of a world built on ambition and speed, on moving forward without looking back. But for the first time, Ethan Cole did not feel the need to move forward. He felt the need to look back, and to finally see what had been there all along. Naomi did not stay in that moment longer than she needed to. She turned again, not abruptly, not emotionally, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had already said everything that mattered. Her steps carried her back into the rhythm of the room, back into the soft hum of service, where conversations about numbers and influence continued as if nothing had shifted. But something had. Ethan stood there for a second longer than expected, the lighter still resting in his palm, his mind no longer racing toward the next deal, but circling something far more unfamiliar. Accountability. He glanced once more at her as she moved between tables, her presence blending into the background again, almost invisible, almost forgotten. Almost. Because now he saw her, not as part of the room, not as part of the service, but as the moment that had forced him to stop. And for a man like Ethan Cole, stopping was not natural. It was necessary. He turned slowly and walked back toward the table, the same table that had defined his nights for years, where decisions were made quickly, confidently, without hesitation. But tonight, the chair he had left behind did not feel the same. It did not feel like control. It felt like a choice. The executives watched him carefully as he returned, their expressions a mix of expectation and uncertainty. They had seen him walk away. They had seen him hesitate. And in their world, hesitation was a weakness. Ethan took his seat again, but not in the same way, between what he had become and what he had once needed to survive. The room noticed that, not because they understood it, because it did not belong. Before we move forward, Ethan said, his voice calm but different now, no longer carrying the edge of urgency. I have a question. That alone was enough to shift the atmosphere again. Ethan did not ask questions at this stage. He gave answers. He made decisions. But tonight was not following that script. When you evaluate a partnership, he continued, looking around the table, meeting each set of eyes without rushing. Do you only measure what someone brings to the table today? A few glances were exchanged. Confusion. Caution. Of course, one of the partners replied, trying to keep the tone steady. That is how business works. Ethan nodded slowly, acknowledging the logic. He had lived by it, built on it, trusted it, until now. Then we have been measuring the wrong things, he said. The sentence did not raise his voice. It lowered the room. Silence followed, heavier this time, because it did not come from uncertainty. It came from disruption. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting near the lighter, not touching it, but close enough to remind himself why he was speaking differently. Because the people who matter the most, he said, are often the ones no one measures at all. The words were not directed at Naomi. Not directly, but they carried her presence into a room that had never considered her part of the equation. The executives finally leaned forward, his tone measured but edged with concern. Ethan, with all due respect, we are not here to debate philosophy. We are here to close a deal. The words were familiar. Efficient. Clean. The kind of thinking that had built everything Ethan once valued above all else. Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the logic without surrendering to it. And we will, he said calmly. But not the way we used to. That single sentence moved through the table like a quiet ripple. Not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Another partner frowned, glancing briefly at the lighter sitting beside the contract, as if trying to understand how something so small had disrupted something so large. Then explain, he said, his voice more direct now. Ethan leaned forward, resting his hands lightly on the table, his posture no longer about control, but about presence. We evaluate companies based on numbers, growth, potential. He began, his voice steady, grounded. But we rarely ask how those numbers are built. Who gets overlooked? Who gets dismissed? Who gets treated as if they do not matter? Closely waiting. Not impatient now. Just alert. Ethan's voice softened slightly, but it did not lose strength. How does this partnership treat the people no one notices? The question did not echo. It settled. Deep. Unavoidable. One of the partners opened his mouth to respond, then paused, realizing there was no prepared answer for that. Because that had never been the question. Not in rooms like this. Not in deals like this. Ethan leaned back slightly, giving the space back to them, not as a retreat, but as an invitation. For the first time, he was not leading them to a conclusion. He was asking them to see something they had always stepped past. And across the room, Naomi continued her work, her movements steady, her presence quiet, as if none of this belonged to her. But it did, because without her, this question would have never existed. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Cole was not just changing the outcome of a deal. He was changing what it meant to deserve one. No one answered immediately, not because they did not want to, because they could not. The question Ethan had placed on the table did not belong to numbers or projections or timelines. It belonged to something far less predictable. Conscience. One of the senior partners adjusted his posture, clearing his throat as if preparing to bring the conversation back to safer ground. We treat our employees well, he said carefully. Competitive salaries, benefits, structured growth. It sounded right. It sounded complete. It sounded like the kind of answer that usually ended discussions like this. But tonight it did not. Ethan nodded slowly, acknowledging the effort, but his expression did not change. That is what we say, he replied. I am asking what we do when no one is watching. The distinction settled into the room with quiet force. Because everyone there understood what he meant. Not policies. Not statements. Behavior. Choices. The way power moved when it was not being observed. The partner hesitated, just for a second, and that second said more than any prepared response ever could. Ethan did not press him. He did not need to. The silence had already done the work. He reached forward again, his fingers brushing lightly against the lighter resting on the contract, then sliding it aside just enough to reveal the line where his signature was meant to go. He picked up the pen. The room leaned in, almost instinctively, drawn back into the familiar rhythm of decision. This was the moment they understood. The moment they expected. Ethan Cole, decisive, controlled, closing another chapter of success. But his hand did not move right away. He looked at the paper one more time, then lifted his gaze, not to the executives, not to the numbers, but across the room. Naomi stood near the far wall now, speaking quietly to another table, her posture the same, her presence unchanged, as if none of this had anything to do with her. And maybe that was the point. She had not asked for recognition. She had not asked for anything at all. She had simply reminded him. Ethan lowered his eyes back to the contract. The pen hovered for a moment longer. Then, slowly, deliberately, he set it down. Not signing. Not yet. The shift was immediate. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just undeniable. We will revise the terms, he said calmly. A ripple of surprise moved through the table, sharper this time. Revise? Someone repeated, unable to hide the disbelief. Ethan nodded once. We include a clause, he continued, his voice steady, grounded in something that did not need approval. Employee treatment standards. Transparency in management practices. Accountability at every level. The room processed the words quickly, calculating, adjusting, realizing this was no longer a suggestion. It was a condition. That is not standard. One of them said, cautious now. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. Neither is forgetting who you are, he replied. The sentence ended the discussion before it could begin. Because this was no longer negotiation. It was definition. A long silence followed, but this time it was different. Not resistance. Not confusion. Acceptance. The terms of the deal had changed. And so had the man leading it. Ethan leaned back slightly, the tension in his posture gone, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. Not control. Alignment. He picked up the lighter again, turning it once between his fingers, then slipping it into his pocket, not as a souvenir, not as a reminder he might forget, but as something he intended to carry forward. Across the room, Naomi finished her task and moved toward the exit, her shift nearing its end, her presence already fading back into the world that rarely noticed her. Ethan watched her go, not with urgency, not with regret, but with understanding. He did not call out this time. He did not stop her, because he no longer needed to hold the moment in place. He had already taken what it came to give. And as the city lights flickered beyond the glass, reflecting a world built on power and progress, one thing had quietly, permanently shifted. Ethan Cole still had the money. He still had the influence. He still had the room. But tonight, for the first time in years, he also had something he could not buy back once lost. The memory of who he was. And the choice to never forget it again.